There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a friend leaning against you on a sofa. You don't recognize them as watersheds at the time. There is no thunderclap, no orchestral score swelling in the background. There is only the moment itself, and the slow, creeping realization, much later, that every single thing that followed grew from the seed of that seemingly insignificant instant. For me, that moment was a question whispered into the blue-gray light of a television screen. It was a request that felt less like a key and more like a stick of dynamite handed to a man standing in front of the one door he had spent years pretending did not exist. It was the moment the architecture of my entire world began to tremble, threatening to collapse into a beautiful, terrifying ruin. Julian had been quiet for nearly an hour, a monumental feat for a man whose energy usually filled a room like rising water. He was sprawled on the opposite end of our worn-out leather couch, one long leg hooked over the armrest, his gaze fixed on the muted nature documentary playing on the screen. He was a landscape of controlled power even in repose. The broad set of his shoulders, the defined lines of his arms forged by a decade in the pool, the restless tap of a finger against his thigh. He was a creature of kinetic energy, and this stillness was an alien thing on him. It was a stillness born of exhaustion, the kind that sinks right into the bone marrow. His breakup with Sarah had been a slow, grinding affair, a war of attrition that had left him hollowed out. And his shoulder injury, the one that had pulled him from the water and placed his entire swimming career in jeopardy, was a constant, gnawing presence. He was a man untethered from his own identity, and he had drifted into the quiet harbor of our shared apartment like a ship with a broken rudder. I was on my end of the couch, laptop balanced on my knees, editing a set of photos from a recent shoot. The soft clicks of my trackpad were the only sounds I contributed to the room. I was pretending to be absorbed, pretending that the sheer gravitational pull of his silent misery wasn't warping the space between us. I had learned, over our years of friendship, to build a fortress around my feelings for him. It was a well-constructed fortress, built of inside jokes, easy camaraderie, and a carefully maintained platonic distance. I was the steady friend, the quiet observer, the one who listened to his girl troubles and offered level-headed advice while a silent storm raged within my own chest. My feelings for Julian were a private language I never spoke, a collection of photographs I never developed, stored away in a darkroom deep inside me. To let them out felt like it would overexpose everything, bleaching our friendship of all its comfortable color and leaving it a stark, unrecognizable white. So I focused on the screen, on adjusting the contrast of a black and white portrait, on the minute details I could control. I could feel his gaze shift from the television to me. It was a tangible thing, a weight settling on the side of my face. I didn't look up. Looking up would be an acknowledgement, an invitation. I kept my eyes on the pixels, on the curve of a shadow on a stranger's face, and I held my breath. The silence stretched, thin and taut, until it felt like it might snap. Leo. His voice was rough, frayed at the edges. I finally allowed myself to turn, my carefully constructed wall of nonchalance crumbling with that single word. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was lost, utterly and completely lost. Not the frustration of a bad race or the annoyance of a failed exam. This was a profound, existential confusion, the look of a man staring at a map of a country he no longer recognized as his own. His eyes, usually a bright, confident blue, were dark and clouded, like a summer sky right before a storm. "Hey," I said softly, closing my laptop and setting it aside. The pretense of work was suddenly absurd. "You okay?" He gave a short, humorless laugh that was more of a choked exhale. "Define okay." He shifted, swinging his leg off the armrest and turning to face me more directly. The space between us on the couch suddenly felt both vast and non-existent. Everything is. I don't know. Wrong. The things that are supposed to feel good don't. The things that are supposed to make sense don't. He gestured vaguely at the television, where a flock of birds was now soaring over a canyon. I feel like I'm speaking a different language from everyone else. Like I missed a memo on how to just be. I knew this feeling. It was the native tongue of my own interior world. But hearing it from Julian, the golden boy, The effortlessly charming swimmer who moved through the world with such apparent ease was disorienting. It was like watching a statue confess to being lonely. I didn't know what to say, so I just watched him, my hands resting in my lap, trying to project an aura of calm I was nowhere near feeling. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He was vulnerable, and his vulnerability was a high-voltage current that electrified the air. I wanted to reach out, to put a hand on his knee, to offer some small physical comfort. But that was a line I had never, ever crossed. It was a border on our map that remained firmly, inviolably drawn. He must have seen the conflict in my eyes, the silent, frantic debate. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. The blue-gray light from the screen cast shadows across his face, making him look older, more serious than I'd ever seen him. He was searching for something in my expression, and the thought of what he might find there terrified me. Then he spoke the words that became the epicenter of the earthquake. "Teach me," he whispered, the sound so quiet it was almost swallowed by the silence. I blinked. "Teach you what?" "Physical therapy exercises. How to burn toast less." I tried for a joke, a deflection, a return to the safety of our usual dynamic. It fell flat, a dead weight in the space between us. "No," he shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. His eyes never left mine. "Teach me what you like." My breath hitched in my throat. The air solidified. It was impossible to misunderstand. The context, the tone, the raw need in his eyes, it was all there. He wasn't talking about movies or books. He was talking about me. He was referencing the one fundamental truth about me that we had spent 8 years tacitly ignoring. He was standing on the other side of that door I had barricaded, and he was asking me to open it. My mind raced, a chaotic flood of panic and a wild, terrifying hope. Was this a drunken, misery-fueled impulse? A cry for help so desperate he didn't even know what he was asking? Or was it something more? Had he seen something in me all this time? Something I thought I had hidden so perfectly? "Julian," I started, my voice strained. I don't think you know what you're saying. You're going through a lot right now. You and Sarah just..." "This has nothing to do with Sarah," he cut me off, his voice firm, though still quiet. "This has to do with this. With you. You're the only thing that feels real right now. The only person who... I don't know. You're just here. And you're quiet. And you see things," he gestured toward my laptop. "You see things the way they are. I feel like I don't know how to see anything anymore." He paused, and then he delivered the final, devastating blow to my defenses. The condition that made the request both impossible and profoundly intimate. "Teach me what you like," he repeated, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a conspiratorial whisper that was meant only for me. "Then, don't let me use words." He held my gaze for a long moment, his expression a mixture of desperation and a strange, unnerving trust. And then he did something that shattered the last of my resolve. He slowly, deliberately, lay down on the couch, shifting his body until his head was resting in my lap. He didn't ask. He just did it. He curled onto his side, facing away from me toward the back of the couch, and closed his eyes. The weight of his head, the warmth of it seeping through the denim of my jeans, was a foreign and yet deeply familiar sensation, something I had imagined 1,000 times but never believed would happen. He had crossed the border. He had stepped over the line and then curled up on the ground, leaving the next move, and all of its terrifying consequences, entirely up to me. My hand hovered in the air above his hair, trembling. To understand the sheer magnitude of that moment, the seismic shift it represented, you have to understand the foundation upon which our friendship was built. We met in the most cliché of ways. The university housing lottery had declared us roommates. I had arrived first, a lanky, quiet 19-year-old with 2 boxes of books, a camera bag, and a deep-seated anxiety about forced social interaction. Our room was a sterile white box, smelling faintly of industrial paint, a blank canvas that I had no idea how to fill. I had meticulously unpacked my things on my side, creating a small, ordered territory in the anonymous space. My books were shelved, my desk was arranged, my camera lenses were lined up like little soldiers. It was an attempt to impose order on a situation that felt chaotic and overwhelming. Then Julian had exploded into the room. It was not a quiet entrance. He kicked the door open because his arms were full with a duffel bag that looked like it had been through a war, a set of swim fins, and a precariously balanced, slightly wilted potted plant. He dropped everything with a loud thud, grinned a grin that seemed to take up half his face, and stuck out a hand that was still damp for some reason. "Julian," he'd said, his voice booming in the small room. "Guess we're cellmates. Hope you don't mind the smell of chlorine." I remember just staring at his hand, at this creature of blinding, unself-conscious energy who had just invaded my carefully curated silence. He was all sun-bleached hair, broad shoulders, and an aura of such vibrant life it felt like the room had suddenly switched from black and white to technicolor. He was everything I was not. He was loud, I was quiet. He was a creature of the body, a swimmer who spoke the language of motion and power, while I was a creature of the eye, a photographer who spoke the language of light and shadow. He collected friends like he was collecting souvenirs, effortlessly charming his way through every social situation. I, on the other hand, treated new people with the cautious trepidation of a bomb disposal expert. By all accounts, we should have grated on each other, a mismatched pair of gears grinding to a halt. We should have lasted one semester before one of us requested a transfer. But we didn't. Instead, something strange happened. Our differences, instead of creating friction, created a kind of complementary balance. His relentless energy forced me out of my shell, dragging me to parties I would have never attended and introducing me to people I would have never met. My quiet presence, in turn, seemed to ground him. Our room became a sanctuary for him, a place where he didn't have to perform. He could come back from a grueling practice, exhausted and silent, and just collapse on his bed without needing to be on. I learned to read his moods not from his words, but from the way he carried himself, the slump of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. He learned that my silence wasn't a judgment, but a form of listening. My feelings for him started as a slow burn, a quiet admiration for his vitality, for the way he lived so completely in the world. It was the way he'd laugh, throwing his head back without reservation. It was the fierce concentration on his face before a race, a look of such focused intensity, it was beautiful. It was the small, unexpected moments of kindness. The time he brought me a coffee without my asking because he knew I'd been up all night studying, or the way he'd fiercely defend my photography to his jock friends who didn't get it. It was 1,000 tiny things that coalesced, over time, into a deep and unwavering affection that I knew I could never, ever voice. He was, for all intents and purposes, straight. His life was a parade of girlfriends, each one seemingly lovelier and more perfectly suited to him than the last. There was Kate, the fiery soccer player in our freshman year. Then came Megan, the studious pre-med major. And finally, there was Sarah, the one everyone, including me, thought was it. They were together for 3 years, a golden couple who seemed to glide through life on a cloud of mutual adoration. I played my role perfectly. I was the confidant, the brother, the one who helped him pick out anniversary gifts and listened to him vent about their minor squabbles. I sat across from them at dinner, smiling and making jokes, while feeling like a ghost at the feast. Every laugh they shared, every casual touch, was a small, sharp paper cut on my heart. I channeled it all into my art. Julian became my unwilling, unknowing muse. I have hundreds of photos of him, most of which he's never seen. Candid shots of him studying, his brow furrowed in concentration. A silhouette of him standing by the window, the morning light tracing the line of his shoulders. The back of his neck as he watched a movie, the fine hairs there catching the light. They were acts of devotion, of observation. My camera allowed me to look, really look, in a way that would have been too intimate, too revealing, without the lens as a barrier. The camera was my shield and my confessional. It was the only place I could be honest about the way he affected me. The photographs were my unsent love letters, filled with a longing so potent I could barely stand to look at them myself sometimes. Our apartment after graduation was a natural extension of that dorm room. It was a bigger box, but the dynamic was the same. He was a consultant now, a job that still required him to be relentlessly on, and I was a freelance photographer, piecing together a living from portraits and small commercial gigs. Our home was the decompression chamber, the place where the masks came off. Our friendship was the one constant in the swirling uncertainty of our early 20s. It was precious to me. It was, in many ways, the central pillar of my life. And the thought of jeopardizing it, of making him uncomfortable or forcing him to see me in a way he didn't want to, was my greatest fear. It was better to have him this way, as a friend, than to not have him at all. That was the mantra I repeated to myself, the bargain I had made with the universe. I would keep my secret, and in exchange, I would get to keep him. And then, in the space of 3 months, his world fell apart. The consulting firm he worked for had a massive round of layoffs, and his project was cut. He was given a generous severance, but was suddenly adrift professionally. It was a blow to his pride, to his identity as the guy who always succeeded. 2 weeks later, during a charity swim meet he'd been training for, a sharp, tearing pain in his shoulder sent him to the hospital. A torn rotator cuff, the doctor said. A serious one. Surgery was an option, but his competitive swimming days were almost certainly over. The one thing that had defined him since he was 6 years old was gone. And then, Sarah. The breakup wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was quiet. She said he'd become distant, angry, that he wasn't the man she'd fallen in love with anymore. She said it with a sad, gentle finality that offered no room for argument. She was right, of course. He was a stranger to himself, so how could he not be a stranger to her? He retreated into our apartment like a wounded animal. He'd sleep until noon, spend the afternoon aimlessly scrolling through his phone, and barely speak. The vibrant, kinetic energy that had once been his defining characteristic was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating lethargy. He was a star that had collapsed in on itself, and I was the only one there to witness it. I tried to be the good friend. I made sure he ate. I sat with him in silence. I didn't push, didn't offer platitudes. I just stayed. I became his anchor in the storm. I didn't realize, until much later, that in his desperation, he had started tying his rope to me in ways that went far beyond friendship. He was looking for a new shore, and he had washed up on mine. The shift was subtle at first. It began with the nights. He couldn't sleep. The pain in his shoulder and the relentless churn of his thoughts kept him awake. I'd often be up late in the living room, editing photos, the glow of my screen the only light in the apartment. I'd hear his bedroom door creak open, and a few moments later, he'd appear in the doorway, a ghost in sweatpants and an old t-shirt. He wouldn't say anything at first. He'd just go to the kitchen, get a glass of water, and then linger in the space between the kitchen and the living room, as if waiting for an invitation. The first time, I had said, "Can't sleep?" He'd just shaken his head and come to sit on the far end of the couch, pulling a blanket over his legs. We sat like that for an hour, in a silence that was comfortable, familiar. The next night, he did the same, but he sat a little closer. The night after that, closer still. It was a slow, deliberate encroachment on my personal space, a gravitational pull I was powerless to resist. I continued to pretend to work, my focus on my screen, but my entire being was attuned to him. I was aware of the warmth radiating from his body, the sound of his soft, even breathing, the way the faint scent of his soap, a clean, sharp smell like fresh laundry, drifted across the space between us. This became our ritual, a silent, nightly communion. My living room, my late-night work sessions, became his sanctuary, and I, his silent keeper. My fortress of platonic friendship was beginning to feel less like a fortress and more like a sandcastle against a rising tide. The water was seeping in through the walls, and I was frantically trying to patch the holes, to maintain the structure, even as I secretly longed to let the tide wash it all away. I told myself I was just being a good friend. He was in pain. He was lonely. He just needed company. It was a convenient and plausible lie that allowed the ritual to continue without forcing a confrontation. Then, one night, about a week into this new routine, he escalated it. He lay down, stretching his long frame out on the couch, and without a word, rested his head on my thigh. It wasn't my lap, not yet. Just his head, near my knee. The contact was electric. I froze, my fingers hovering over my trackpad. My entire body went rigid. I could feel the texture of his hair, still slightly damp from a shower, through the thin fabric of my sweatpants. I could feel the solid, heavy reality of his skull resting against my leg. It was the most terrifyingly intimate thing I had ever experienced. I wanted to run. I wanted to push him away. I wanted to thread my fingers into his hair and hold him there forever. I did none of those things. I just sat there, rigid and silent, for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, slowly, I forced myself to relax. I went back to my editing, my movements stiff and unnatural. After a few minutes, I heard his breathing deepen, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He had fallen asleep. On me. My heart was doing a frantic, chaotic dance in my chest, a wild mix of terror and a fragile, incandescent joy. He trusted me this much. He felt safe enough with me to be this vulnerable. The thought was both a comfort and a burden. It was a precious, terrifying gift that I had no idea what to do with. This became the new ritual. He would come out, sit for a few minutes, and then lie down, his head finding its now familiar place on my thigh. Sometimes he'd talk, his voice a low murmur, about his physical therapy, about a stupid article he read online, about nothing. But mostly, he was silent. And eventually, he would fall asleep. And I would sit there, for hours sometimes, a living statue, afraid to move and wake him, just listening to him breathe. In those quiet hours, in the blue light of my laptop, I allowed myself to feel the truth. I allowed myself to acknowledge the depth of my love for this broken, beautiful man who had fallen asleep in my care. It was a dangerous indulgence, a secret feast I held in the dead of night, knowing that the dawn would bring a return to the necessary pretense. The metaphor of the open door began around this time. He started leaving his bedroom door ajar when he went to bed. Not wide open, just cracked. It was a sliver of light in the dark hallway, an unspoken question. It was a stark contrast to the firm, decisive click of his door closing that had been the soundtrack to the end of our nights for years. I knew what it was. Or, I thought I knew. It was an invitation. An invitation to what? I wasn't sure. An invitation to talk? An invitation to check on him? An invitation for more? It was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. If I never walked through it, he never had to acknowledge the invitation was made. If I did, well, that was the question that kept me rooted to the couch. I never did. I would finish my work, watch him sleep on the couch for a little while longer, and then, with the careful precision of a safecracker, I would gently slide out from under his head, replacing my leg with a pillow. He would stir, but he never woke. Then I would go to my own room, at the opposite end of the hall, and close my own door, my heart aching with the weight of all the things I hadn't done, all the words I hadn't said. The open door was a challenge, a dare, and every night I failed to meet it. It felt like a small, personal cowardice. I was the quiet observer, the man who lived behind the lens, and I was too afraid to step into the frame myself. The rituals were a slow-acting poison and a life-sustaining medicine all at once. They were killing me with anxiety and hope, and they were the only thing keeping me going. The proximity was a sweet torture. The smell of him, the warmth of him, the simple, solid fact of his presence. It was everything I had ever wanted and everything I couldn't have. I was living in a state of suspended animation, trapped in the amber of this strange, new intimacy, waiting for something to break. Waiting for the moment when the tension would become so great that it would have to snap, one way or another. I was analyzing every gesture, every sigh, every flicker of an eyelid, searching for a sign, for a clue, for permission. I was developing the image in my mind, watching it slowly emerge from the chemical bath, terrified of what the final picture would reveal. Would it be a picture of two friends, one comforting the other in a time of need? Or would it be a picture of something else entirely, something fragile and new and desperately wanted? The night it finally broke was different. There was a storm outside, a wild, lashing rain that beat against the windows like a frantic fist. The sound filled the apartment, a constant, rushing roar that seemed to amplify the silence inside. Julian hadn't gone to his physical therapy session that day. He'd said his shoulder was aching too much, a deep, throbbing pain that the rain seemed to be making worse. He'd been sullen and withdrawn all evening, barely touching the dinner I'd made. We were on the couch, in our usual positions. I was pretending to read a book, and he was lying with his head in my lap. He hadn't moved from the couch to my lap this time. He had just lain down directly, a subtle but significant shift in the choreography of our ritual. It was a statement of assumption, of right. My lap was his place now. I had a hand resting on the couch beside his head, my fingers just inches from his hair. The urge to touch him was a physical ache, a fire in my palm. He wasn't asleep. I could tell by the tension in his body, the subtle rigidity in his neck. He was just lying there, his eyes closed, listening to the rain. After a long time, he spoke, his voice so low I could barely hear him over the storm. "It's never going to get better, is it?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of despair. He was talking about his shoulder, his career, his life. Everything. My heart broke for him. All the analysis, all the anxiety, all the fear about what this meant for me, it all melted away in that moment, replaced by a simple, overwhelming need to comfort him. Slowly, tentatively, I lowered my hand. My fingers brushed against his hair. It was soft, thick. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, I felt him release a long, shuddering breath, a sound of such profound weariness it felt like a surrender. Emboldened, I let my hand settle, my fingers gently threading into the strands at his temple. It was a boundary crossed, a seal broken. For years, my hands had known only the cold, hard metal of my camera, the smooth paper of my photographs. Now, they were learning the language of his hair, the warmth of his skin. He was completely still for a moment. Then, he shifted, turning his head just enough to press his cheek more firmly into my palm. It was an answer. It was permission. It was a reciprocal gesture of trust that sent a shockwave through my entire system. We stayed like that for a long time, the only sounds the drumming of the rain and the soft whisper of our breathing. My thumb began to move, stroking a slow, steady circle on his temple. It was an instinctive gesture, an unconscious act of soothing. The air in the room grew thick, charged with a new kind of energy. The platonic pretext had been burned away by that one simple touch. We were no longer just two friends on a couch. We were two people, a man with his head in another man's lap, a hand in his hair, in the middle of a storm, and the unspoken thing between us was suddenly the loudest thing in the room. He shifted again, rolling onto his back so he could look up at me. His head was still in my lap, but now our eyes were locked. His face was a landscape of shadows and vulnerability in the dim light. The lost look was still there, but it was mingled with something else now. A question. A plea. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This was it. The precipice. The moment where the photograph finally develops, for better or for worse. I could feel the tremor in my own hand, which was still resting against his cheek. "Leo," he whispered, his voice hoarse. His eyes searched mine, and I knew that whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The old world was gone. My own voice was a stranger to me when I finally found it. "What is it, Julian?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he lifted a hand, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw, a mirror of the gesture I had just made. His touch was hesitant, uncertain, but it sent a jolt of lightning through me. His thumb brushed against my lower lip. It was the lightest of touches, a ghost of a sensation, but it felt like a brand. And then he asked the question that wasn't a question at all. Would it be okay? His voice was barely audible, a fragile thread of sound in the storm-filled room. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I knew what he was asking. And in that moment, all the fear, all the years of carefully constructed walls, all the reasons I should say no, they all turned to dust. There was only him, his face illuminated by the faint light, his eyes filled with a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. There was only this one, singular moment of truth. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. He rose up slowly, pushing himself up on one elbow, his other hand still cupping my face. He moved with a dreamlike slowness, as if he was afraid I might bolt. He paused when his face was just inches from mine, his eyes searching mine one last time for confirmation, for consent. I didn't flinch. I just held his gaze, my own eyes telling him everything I had never been able to say. Yes, please. Finally. Then he closed the distance. The first touch of his lips to mine was impossibly soft. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a confession. It was the hesitant touch of two worlds colliding, of a line being crossed with a reverent, terrifying care. It was just a gentle pressure, a moment of stillness where the entire universe seemed to hold its breath. And then he pulled back, just a fraction of an inch, his forehead resting against mine, his eyes closed. Okay, he breathed out. The word a sigh of relief, of shock, of something I couldn't yet name. Okay, I whispered back, my voice trembling. The storm raged on outside, but inside, in the small, sacred space between us, there was a profound and unnerving calm. The thing had been done. The unspoken had been given a voice, not of words, but of touch. And we were left in the quiet, terrifying, beautiful aftermath, two people stranded on the shore of a world made new. The morning after was a study in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not the comfortable quiet of our old friendship, nor the charged, intimate stillness of the night before. It was a brittle, anxious silence, stretched thin over a chasm of unspoken fear. I woke up on the couch, a crick in my neck, the gray morning light filtering through the blinds. The spot where Julian's head had been was cold. The apartment was too quiet. I found him in the kitchen, already dressed in running gear, staring into an empty coffee mug as if it held the answers to the universe. He didn't look at me when I walked in. His entire posture was a fortress. His shoulders were tense, his jaw was set, and he was radiating an aura of such profound avoidance it was like a physical force field. "Morning," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Hey," he mumbled into the mug, still not looking at me. He cleared his throat. "Going for a run." It was a lie. His shoulder was still injured. He couldn't run. He was fleeing. The man who had been a creature of kinetic energy was now using that energy to escape, not from the world, but from me, from what we had done. My heart, which had been tentatively soaring, plummeted. A cold, sick dread pooled in my stomach. I had misread everything. It had been a moment of grief-fueled madness for him, a desperate reach for comfort that he now deeply regretted. I had taken advantage of his vulnerability. I was the creepy, pining gay friend who had finally gotten what he wanted, and now he was disgusted by it, and by me. The narrative of my deepest fears wrote itself in my head with brutal, efficient clarity. "Julian," I started, my voice soft, pleading. "About last night." I was tired. He cut me off, his voice sharp, defensive. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were guarded, shuttered. The vulnerable, open man from the night before was gone, replaced by a stranger. I wasn't thinking straight. It was a mistake. A mistake. The word landed like a punch to the gut. It knocked the air from my lungs. I felt a hot, prickling shame creep up my neck. I had allowed myself a moment of hope, and this was the price. I had let the tide in, and it had not just washed away the sandcastle of our friendship. It had revealed it to be nothing but a pathetic mound of dirt, and now the tide was receding, leaving me exposed and foolish on the empty shore. I just stared at him, unable to speak. The hurt must have been plain on my face, because a flicker of something, guilt, regret, crossed his features before he shuddered it away again. He couldn't hold my gaze. He turned, rinsed his mug in the sink with unnecessary force, and headed for the door. "I've, got to go," he said, his hand on the doorknob. "Physical therapy. I'll be back late." Another lie. His appointment wasn't until the afternoon. And then he was gone, the click of the door closing behind him like a final judgment. I stood alone in the kitchen, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me, the ghost of his lips on mine, turning from a memory of impossible softness to a brand of shame. I had risked everything for one moment of connection, and I had lost. For the next 3 days, we were ghosts in our own home. We moved around each other, occupying the same space, but never at the same time. If I was in the kitchen, he was in his room. If he came into the living room, I would suddenly find something urgent to do in my own bedroom. The nightly ritual was shattered. He no longer sought me out. His bedroom door, which had been a tantalizing sliver of an invitation, was now firmly, unequivocally shut. The silence was no longer comfortable or charged. It was a weapon, a wall he had built between us, brick by painful brick. The pain of it was a physical thing. It was worse than the years of silent pining. The pining had been sweetened with the comfort of our friendship. This was just a hollow ache, a void where that friendship used to be. I had not only lost the possibility of something more, I had lost the one thing that had been my anchor. I cycled through a toxic cocktail of emotions: hurt, anger, self-loathing, and a deep, profound sadness. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for being so willing to throw away our years of friendship because he was scared. I was angry at myself for being so naive, for daring to hope. On the 4th night, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was going to drive me insane. I was sitting on the couch, the same couch where he had kissed me, and the memory was a fresh wound. I was staring at his closed bedroom door, a symbol of his retreat. And something inside me, a core of anger and hurt that had been smoldering for days, finally ignited. I was not going to let him destroy us with his fear. Our friendship, what we had, was worth more than that. It was worth fighting for. Even if the fight ended in total destruction, it was better than this slow, silent death. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked down the hall. I stood in front of his closed door for a long moment, my heart hammering against my ribs. My hand was shaking as I raised it to knock. I didn't knock. Instead, I just turned the knob and pushed the door open. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, in the dark, just staring at the wall. He was still in the clothes he'd worn that day. He looked up as I entered, his face a mask of surprise and something that looked like fear. "We need to talk," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I closed the door behind me, shutting us in together. There would be no escape this time. He looked away, shaking his head. "Leo, don't." "No," I said, taking a step closer. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to kiss me and then pretend I don't exist. You don't get to throw away 8 years of friendship because you got scared." My voice was shaking, but I didn't care. "What you did, it wasn't a mistake. It might have been confusing, it might have been terrifying for you, but it wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing that has ever happened between us. And you are running from it like a coward." He flinched at the word coward, but he didn't deny it. He just sat there, his shoulders slumped, the picture of defeat. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know what I'm doing. I look in the mirror, and I don't know who that is anymore. I'm not a swimmer. I'm not Sarah's boyfriend. I'm not anything. And then, that night, with you, it was the only thing that felt right in months. It felt easy. It felt like coming home. And that scares the hell out of me." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were swimming with unshed tears. The wall was down. The fortress had crumbled. He was just Julian again, lost and scared and heartbreakingly honest. "I don't know how to be that person," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what it means. All my life, I've been this." He gestured vaguely at his own body, at the room, at the invisible architecture of the life he thought he was supposed to live. Girls, swimming, a certain kind of future. And now, none of it fits. And you fit. And I don't know what to do with that. I walked over and sat down on the bed next to him, leaving a careful foot of space between us. The anger had drained out of me, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost buckled me. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting a version of himself he was terrified of becoming. "So you decided it was better to lose me completely than to try and figure it out?" I asked, my voice gentle now. He nodded, shamefaced. I thought I was protecting you. From my own confusion. I thought I was protecting our friendship. I broke it instead." He finally broke, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. "I'm sorry, Leo. I am so sorry." I watched him for a long moment, this strong, beautiful man, utterly broken by his own fear. And in that moment, I knew that the request he had made on the couch, the one that had started all of this, was still the only way forward. He was a man of the body, a man who had lost his faith in words, in plans, in the maps he had been given. He needed a different kind of language. I waited until his breathing had steadied, until the room was filled with a fragile, tentative peace. He was looking at his hands, twisting them in his lap. He was lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, and I knew I had to give him a thread to follow. "Julian," I said softly. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a weary, desperate hope. He didn't need to say anything. I could see the plea in his eyes, the same plea from the night on the couch, the plea for guidance, for a path through the wilderness of his own feelings. He was lost, and he was asking me for a map, but he was terrified of the language it was written in. So I made him a promise, a new kind of lesson. "Okay," I said, my voice low and steady. I remembered his words, the ones that had terrified and thrilled me, the ones that now seemed like the only possible solution. "You want to figure this out? We'll figure it out, but we'll do it your way." He looked at me, confused. "My way?" I took a deep breath. You said teach you what I like. And then you said, no words. You can't do words right now. So, fine." I held his gaze, my expression unwavering. "No words. We'll just be, and we'll see what happens. No labels. No future planning. No big, scary conversations. Just this. Right now." Can you do that? A look of profound relief washed over his face, so palpable it was like watching a great weight be lifted from his shoulders. He was being offered a reprieve, a way to explore this terrifying new territory without having to name it, without having to define it before he understood it. He was being offered a space to just feel. He nodded, a slow, grateful movement. Yes, he whispered. I can do that. The pact was made. We would communicate in a new language, a language of proximity, of touch, of gesture, a language of quiet observation and mutual consent. It was a terrifying and beautiful proposition, an experiment in intimacy that had no precedent and no rules. It was a path we would have to create ourselves, one hesitant, silent step at a time. I had no idea where it would lead. But for the first time in days, as I sat beside him in the quiet darkness of his room, I wasn't afraid. I was just ready. The first lesson was silence. After our pact, we didn't speak for a long time. We just sat on the edge of his bed, the space between us humming with a new, fragile understanding. The guilt and anger had evaporated, leaving behind a clean, quiet emptiness that was not uncomfortable. It was a blank slate. I eventually stood up and went to the door. He watched me, a flicker of panic in his eyes, the fear that I was leaving, that this new truce was already over. I just gave him a small, reassuring smile and went to the kitchen. I came back with 2 glasses of water, handed one to him, and sat back down on the bed, a little closer this time. It was a simple gesture, but it was a statement. I'm not running. I'm here. He took the glass, his fingers brushing against mine, and the brief contact was a conversation in itself. That night, the ritual of the couch returned, but it was different. It was intentional. When he came out to the living room, I closed my laptop and set it aside immediately. I looked at him, a clear and open invitation. He came and sat beside me, and after a moment of hesitation, he lay down, resting his head not on my thigh, but fully in my lap, his body curled toward me. It was a deliberate act of vulnerability and offering. My hand, which had once trembled with indecision, went to his hair without hesitation. It felt natural, right? This was our new language. This was the first word. My fingers stroking his temple was a sentence. His sigh of contentment was a reply. We stayed like that until the sky began to lighten, neither of us sleeping, both of us simply existing in the quiet grammar of touch. The teaching became a series of small, incremental explorations. It was about relearning how to exist in a shared space. One afternoon, I was developing photos in the makeshift darkroom I'd set up in our spare bathroom. The red safe light cast a surreal, intimate glow on everything. The door was closed, my usual sign for do not disturb. I heard a soft knock. Not Julian's usual, confident rap, but a hesitant tap. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking uncertain. He just pointed inside and raised his eyebrows in a silent question. Can I come in? I nodded and stepped aside. He came into the tiny, dark space and just stood by the wall, watching me. He watched as I gently agitated the developer tray, as the ghost of an image began to emerge on the paper. He didn't ask what I was doing. He just watched, his presence a quiet, supportive weight in the room. After a few minutes, I felt his hand on my lower back, a simple, grounding touch. It wasn't sexual. It was a gesture of presence. I'm here. I see you. I leaned back into his touch just slightly, a silent acknowledgement. I know. Thank you. We learned to speak in proximity. If he was cooking, I would come and lean against the counter, just being near him. If I was reading on the armchair, he would come and sit on the floor, his back against my legs. We were a study in gravitational pull, 2 celestial bodies that had found a new, stable orbit around each other. The fear of accidental touches was gone, replaced by an intentionality that was both thrilling and deeply calming. A hand brushing his as we reached for the same coffee mug was no longer a source of anxiety, but a small, welcome spark. The open door policy was reinstated, but now it was a 2-way street. His door was always ajar, and I began leaving mine ajar as well. It was a constant, silent signal of accessibility. For a week, that was as far as it went. The couch was our space for physical intimacy. Our beds were still our own separate territories. The hallway was a border, a demarcation line we hadn't yet crossed. The crossing happened, as it always did with us, without a grand declaration. It was late, and I was exhausted from a long shoot. I bypassed the living room entirely and went straight to my room, leaving my door cracked open out of habit. I fell into bed, too tired to even change, and was asleep in minutes. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours of the morning, I was woken by a subtle shift in the mattress. I opened my eyes. In the dim light filtering in from the street, I could see Julian's silhouette. He was carefully, silently, sliding into the bed beside me. He lay on his back, on the very edge of the mattress, as far away as he could be while still being in the bed. He was rigid, holding his breath, waiting for my reaction. I didn't say a word. I just watched the slow rise and fall of his chest. He had walked through the open door. He had crossed the final boundary. He was here, in my bed, scared and silent and waiting. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake, dreaming of this exact moment. I thought it would be filled with passion, with frantic kisses and desperate words. But it wasn't. It was quiet. It was fragile. It was so much more intimate than I ever could have imagined. Slowly, I turned onto my side to face him. He flinched, as if expecting rejection. I just looked at him, and in the darkness, I lifted my hand and placed it on his chest, right over his heart. I could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of it under my palm. I didn't say anything. I just rested my hand there, a silent anchor. After a moment, I felt his own heart rate begin to slow, matching the steady rhythm of my breathing. He released a long, shuddering breath, and his body, which had been so tense, finally relaxed into the mattress. He turned onto his side to face me, our faces just inches apart in the dark. He didn't try to kiss me. He just looked at me, his eyes full of a profound, silent gratitude. And then, he reached out and took my other hand, his fingers lacing with mine on the pillow between us. And we fell asleep like that, hand in hand, in a silence that was fuller and more meaningful than any conversation I had ever had. This was the new normal. The lessons continued. Teaching him what I liked was not about technique or mechanics. It was about presence. It was about showing him that intimacy was not a performance, but a state of being. It was me tracing the new, silvery scar on his shoulder, not with pity, but with a quiet reverence for what his body had endured. It was him learning to initiate a kiss not with a question, but with a look, a soft touch to my face that gave me every opportunity to turn away, which I never did. It was learning the difference between the desperate, clinging hugs of his grief and the new, easy way our bodies fit together, a hug that felt less like holding on and more like coming home. We built a new life in the quiet spaces, in the wordless conversations. We were creating our own language, and we were becoming fluent. The fear that had defined both of us for so long, my fear of rejection, his fear of his own identity, was slowly being replaced by a quiet certainty. The world outside our apartment, with its labels and expectations, still existed. But in here, we had created a sanctuary where none of that mattered. We were not boyfriends. We were not a couple. We were just Leo and Julian. And that was enough. The final lesson, the one that signaled the end of the teaching and the beginning of simply living, happened on a Sunday morning a few months later. I woke up first, as I usually did. Julian was asleep beside me, his arm thrown possessively over my waist, his face peaceful in the morning light. The sight of him, so completely at ease, so at home in my bed, filled me with a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. I slipped out of bed, padded to the kitchen, and started making coffee, the familiar ritual a comforting start to the day. A few minutes later, he appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He was wearing a pair of my sweatpants and one of my old t-shirts. He looked at me, a soft, sleepy smile on his face. He walked over, wrapped his arms around me from behind, and rested his chin on my shoulder, his face nuzzling into my neck. "Morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, leaning back into his embrace. It was an easy, domestic moment, the kind of thing I had seen him share with Sarah 100 times, the kind of thing that had once been a source of such sharp, secret pain. Now it was mine. It was ours. He was quiet for a moment, just holding me as the coffee maker gurgled and hissed. Then he spoke, his voice quiet, right by my ear. "Leo, yeah, I love you." The words were spoken. The silence was finally, gently broken. And it wasn't scary. It wasn't a confession of confusion or a desperate plea. It was a statement of fact. A simple, easy truth. It was the final word in our silent language, the one that summed up all the others. I turned in his arms to face him, my hands coming up to cup his face. I looked into his eyes, his bright, confident blue eyes, no longer clouded with confusion, but clear and full of a love that was as steady and as certain as the morning sun. "I know," I said softly. And then I kissed him, a kiss that wasn't a question or a lesson, but a statement of my own. "I love you too." We are not defined by the grand, sweeping moments of our lives, but by the quiet, incremental shifts that remake our worlds from the inside out. The change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in the space between heartbeats, in a hand that dares to touch, in a door left ajar, in the silent consent to be vulnerable. It's a slow development, an image emerging from the darkness, blurry at first, then gaining clarity until it is the only thing you can see. We had spent so long speaking different languages, he in the language of the world, and I in the language of my own guarded heart. But in the beautiful, honest silence we learned to create together, we found a common tongue. We found not just a new way to speak, but a new world to speak of, a world that was entirely, and finally, our own.